The Galactic Council chamber had never experienced such silence. To 3 hours since Ambassador Sarah Chen's declaration, the vast amphitheater that housed representatives from 47 different species remained frozen in stunned quiet. The crystalline walls, designed to amplify and harmonize voices from across the galaxy, seemed to absorb sound instead, as if the very architecture was holding its breath. Chen stood at the human delegation's modest platform, her hands clasped behind her back, watching the ripple effects of her words spread across the assembled diplomats. The Zephyrian High Regent Cathara's normally radiant crystal form had dimmed to an angry amber, while smaller species representatives huddled together, whispering in languages that their universal translators struggled to process through their fear. "You speak of war," High Regent Cathara finally said, her voice resonating with harmonic overtones that made the chamber's walls vibrate. "A human concept that belongs to your primitive past. The galaxy has evolved beyond such barbarism." Chen turned toward the towering Zephyrian platform, her movement deliberate and calm. Those who knew humans well enough, and there were precious few in the chamber, recognized the stillness that came before action. "Have we? Then explain New Eden to me in terms of this evolved civilization." The question hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before gods who had never been questioned. New Eden had been home to 40,000 human colonists, families who had spent 3 generations turning a barren rock into a garden world. The Zephyrian justification was simple. The colony had violated territorial boundaries by expanding beyond their designated zones. The solution had been simpler still: total sterilization from orbit. "The colony exceeded parameters," High Regent Cathara replied, her harmonic voice showing the first signs of strain. "Imperial law was clear. Consequences were administered. Consequences." Chen repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. 40,000 people, 12,000 of them children, reduced to ash because they planted crops on the wrong side of an invisible line. She paused, letting the weight of those numbers settle. "Tell me, High Regent, what consequences does imperial law prescribe for genocide?" The word genocide sent another wave of whispers through the chamber. In 3 centuries of imperial rule, such accusations had never been leveled publicly. The Zephyrian Empire had built its dominance on the principle of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. Rebellions were crushed before they could form. Dissent was silenced before it could spread. Fear, they had learned, was more efficient than armies, but Chen was not afraid. Genocide. High Regent Cathara's form flared brighter, casting harsh shadows across the chamber. The humans were warned. Compliance was requested. When compliance was refused, order was restored. This is the way of the galaxy. "Your way," Chen corrected, "not ours." The distinction was small but profound. For 3 centuries, subject species had accepted that imperial law was universal law, that Zephyrian logic was the only logic that mattered. By drawing that line, your way versus ours, Chen was doing something revolutionary. She was asserting human independence not just of action but of thought. Ambassador Thax of the Corvan Confederacy, a spider-like being whose species had joined the Empire 2 centuries ago, clicked his mandibles in what humans had learned was agitation. "Ambassador Chen, surely you understand that challenging imperial authority is unproductive. The Corvan people learned this lesson long ago. Accommodation brings peace." Chen looked at Thax with something that might have been pity. "The Corvan people were warriors once. I've read your histories, the ones the Empire allows you to keep. You fought with honor against impossible odds before you were brought to heel. Now you speak of accommodation as if it were wisdom instead of defeat." The accusation sparked angry chittering from the Corvan delegation, but Thax himself fell silent.
The truth of Chen's words was written in his people's diminished territory, their restricted technology, their careful deference to their crystalline masters.
"This is the order of things," High Regent Cathara declared, her form now pulsing with aggressive energy.
"The Empire brings stability. Species that accept this truth prosper. Those that do not..." She gestured toward empty platforms where extinct civilizations had once sent representatives. "The choice is always yours to make." For the first time since her declaration, Chen smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "You're absolutely right. The choice is ours. And we choose war." The words fell like stones into still water, each ripple of consequence spreading outward through the chamber. Several smaller delegations began urgent communications with their homeworlds, while others simply stared in fascination at the human who had just declared war on the most powerful empire in galactic history. Chen continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. Let me tell you what humanity has learned in our short time among the stars. We've learned that the galaxy is vast and beautiful. We've learned that intelligence takes forms we never imagined. We've learned that cooperation can achieve wonders. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates. But we've also learned something else. We've learned that bullies are the same whether they rule a schoolyard or a spiral arm. High Regent Kithara's form had shifted to a deep red, a color combination that translation software marked as extreme aggression mixed with disbelief. You compare the Zephyrian Empire to a schoolyard bully? I compare you to every tyrant in human history, Chen replied without hesitation. You rule through fear. You demand submission. You destroy what you cannot control. The only difference is your scale. She stepped forward, her human frame dwarfed by the towering platforms around her but somehow commanding the chamber's attention. But here's what every tyrant eventually learns. There's always someone who won't kneel. The silence that followed was different from the stunned quiet of before. This was the silence of a galaxy holding its breath, waiting to see if the impossible was actually happening. Representatives who had spent centuries in careful submission to imperial authority were watching a species barely 50 years removed from their homeworld tell that authority to go to hell. Ambassador Vex, 9 of the Synthetic Collective, a race of artificial beings whose crystalline processes had earned them favored status within the Empire, spoke in a voice like harmonized algorithms. Ambassador Chen, we calculate the probability of human success in armed conflict with the Empire at 0.0003%. This path leads only to extinction. Chen nodded thoughtfully. Your calculations are probably correct. In any conventional war, humanity would lose. Badly. The admission sent murmurs through the chamber. Was she backing down? But then, we've never been very good at conventional warfare. The statement hung in the air, pregnant with implications that made several delegations shift uncomfortably. Those few species that had studied human history knew what unconventional warfare looked like when humans practiced it. Guerrilla campaigns that lasted decades. Resistance movements that turned occupation into nightmares. Tactics that turned weakness into strength and turned enemies' advantages against them. You threaten terrorism, High Regent Kithara accused, her harmonic voice now carrying overtones of something that might have been concern. I threaten war, Chen corrected. Everything else is just methodology. The distinction was important. Terrorism implied random violence against innocents. War implied organized resistance with clear objectives and legitimate grievances. By framing humanity's response as war, Chen was claiming the moral authority that came with just cause while keeping all options open for how that war might be prosecuted. From the Nexari delegation came a sound like wind chimes in a storm, their species equivalent of nervous laughter. Ambassador Kellis Nor spoke in their sing-song voice. And what does humanity hope to achieve with this war? The Empire spans 10,000 worlds. Your species controls 3 systems. Chen's smile returned, and this time there was something almost predatory in it. We hope to achieve what every successful revolution has achieved. We hope to show the galaxy that the Empire bleeds. The metaphor was perfect for the moment. The Zephyrians were crystalline beings who didn't actually bleed, but every species in the chamber understood the deeper meaning. Invincibility was an illusion. Empires fell when people stopped believing in their power. And belief, as Chen was demonstrating, was just another kind of war. High Regent Kithara rose from her platform, her crystalline form now burning with energy that made the chamber's walls sing in harmonic resonance. This audience is concluded. The human delegation will surrender themselves for immediate transportation to a suitable correction facility where their treasonous statements can be properly evaluated. But Chen was already moving, her hand reaching for something at her belt. Security systems should have detected any weapon, but what she pulled out wasn't a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a small device no larger than her palm, with a single red button. I wouldn't, she said calmly, holding the device where everyone could see it. This is a quantum transmitter keyed to every human ship, station, and colony in the galaxy. The moment my life signs cease or this device is damaged, it broadcasts a very simple message. The humans have been silenced, the war has begun, and it's time to remind the galaxy what desperate people can accomplish. The chamber erupted in chaos. Security drones that had been moving to surround the human delegation stopped mid-flight. Delegates who had been rising to leave sat back down. And High Regent Kithara, for the first time in her long existence, found herself in a situation where her overwhelming power was irrelevant. Chen pocketed the device and straightened her diplomatic coat with exaggerated care. Now then, I believe there was some territorial boundary discussions on today's agenda. As the representative of an independent human government, I'd like to know exactly which of our worlds you consider imperial property. The question was a trap disguised as diplomacy. Any world the Empire claimed as their own became a legitimate target for human resistance. Any world they disclaimed became a safe haven for human operations. Either way, Chen was forcing them to define the battlefield on which their war would be fought. High Regent Kithara's form had shifted through several color combinations, settling finally on a deep purple that translation software identified as strategic reconsideration. The Empire's greatest strength had always been their ability to project overwhelming force against clearly defined targets. But how do you project force against a species that had just declared war from the middle of your own capital while holding what amounted to a galactic dead man's switch? The Empire acknowledges current human territorial holdings as legitimate, Kithara said finally, each word extracted like a tooth. Chen nodded as if this were a minor administrative detail rather than the first diplomatic victory over the Empire in 3 centuries. Excellent. And New Eden? Was. A regrettable misunderstanding. Was. Genocide. Chen corrected. But we'll settle for reparations. 100 billion credits to the families of the dead. Full territorial restoration of the New Eden system. And a formal apology from the Empire acknowledging wrongdoing. The demands were impossible, of course. The Empire didn't pay reparations. It certainly didn't apologize, and it never admitted wrongdoing. But Chen wasn't really negotiating. She was establishing the terms of the war that was about to begin. Impossible, High Regent Kithara declared. Chen shrugged. Then we'll take what we're owed. She turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something. Oh, and High Regent, you might want to recall your fleets from human space. All of them. Because the next Imperial ship that enters our territory without permission won't be leaving. As the human delegation filed out of the chamber, Chen leading with the casual confidence of someone who had just declared war on gods and lived to walk away, the rest of the galaxy was left to grapple with a new reality. For the first time in 3 centuries, someone had said no to the Empire and meant it. The age of human compliance was over. The age of human defiance had begun. And across 10,000 worlds, species that had forgotten the taste of freedom were about to remember what it meant to hope. Admiral Zex Kalar had commanded the Imperial Third Fleet for 47 years without losing a single engagement. His crystalline form, marked by the battle scars that were considered marks of honor among Zephyrian military castes, gleamed with prideful energy as he reviewed the fleet deployment around Proxima Centauri, humanity's nearest colonial outpost. The deployment was massive by any reasonable standard. 300 ships ranging from patrol craft to dreadnoughts, enough firepower to sterilize a dozen worlds. It was also, Zex Kalar knew, completely unnecessary for dealing with a few human colonies. But High Regent Kithara's orders had been specific. Make an example that would end this ridiculous notion of human independence before it could spread to other species. Admiral, his tactical officer Nexirim reported. Human vessels are approaching the perimeter. They're requesting permission to enter their own system. Zex Kalar's form shifted to an amused blue-green. The audacity was almost refreshing. How many ships? 7, sir. Frigate class or smaller. They appear to be trade vessels. Derricks, Patience, Reading, and others take compliments. Even by human standards, it seemed suicidal. Inform them that this system is under Imperial jurisdiction pending resolution of recent diplomatic irregularities. They will submit to boarding and inspection or be destroyed. The response came back within minutes. Message received and understood. Human vessels are complying with inspection protocols. Zex Kalar watched with satisfaction as the human ships powered down weapons and shields, allowing Imperial boarding parties to take control. It was exactly the sort of rapid capitulation he had expected once humans saw the futility of their position. Whatever madness had possessed their ambassador in the council chambers, reality was clearly reasserting itself. Admiral. Nexirim's voice carried a note of confusion. The boarding parties report unusual cargo manifests. Unusual how? The ships appear to be carrying medical supplies, construction equipment, and children's toys? Zex Kalar turned his full attention to the tactical display. Trade vessels carrying relief supplies to a system that had just been placed under military quarantine? It made no sense unless... Are these refugee ships? Negative, sir. The humans claim to be delivering supplies to the Proxima colonies. They say they have contracts to fulfill. The explanation was absurd. No species conducted normal commerce in the face of Imperial military action. Fear alone should have kept every human vessel light years away from this system. Unless the humans were too primitive to understand their situation or Sir, another officer reported, we're receiving a transmission from the lead human vessel. They're requesting to speak with you directly. Zex Kalar considered refusing. What could humans possibly have to say that would interest him? But curiosity won. Put them through. The holographic display shimmered to life, revealing a human female in what appeared to be a merchant captain's uniform. She was older than most humans Zex Kalar had encountered, with grey streaking through her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent in space. Most remarkably, she showed no signs of the fear that should have been overwhelming her. Admiral Zex Kalar, she said with a polite nod. I'm Captain Elena Vasquez, of the merchant vessel Maria's Dream. I understand you're conducting inspections today. Captain Vasquez, Zex Kalar replied, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of bemused superiority. You appear to be lost. This system is under Imperial military control. Civilian traffic is prohibited. Vasquez nodded thoughtfully. I see the confusion, Admiral, but these aren't Imperial systems. These are human systems, and we're human merchants conducting legitimate business with human colonies. She paused, consulting something off camera. I have the relevant documentation if you'd like to review it. The calm reasonableness in her voice was almost more infuriating than outright defiance would have been. Captain, perhaps you are unaware of recent developments, but your government has made certain unfortunate statements that require correction. Until that correction is complete, all human territories are subject to Imperial oversight. Oh, I'm aware of Ambassador Chen's declaration, Vasquez replied with the same polite tone she might use to discuss weather patterns. Quite stirring stuff. But that doesn't change the fact that we have contracts to fulfill. The children on Proxima Station are expecting their educational supplies, and the construction teams need their equipment. Commerce continues, Admiral, regardless of politics. Zex Kalar felt his form shift toward an irritated orange. The human was being deliberately obtuse. Captain, I will explain this once more, simply. You will leave this system immediately, or you will be destroyed. There are no other options. For the first time, Vasquez's expression changed. The polite smile faded, replaced by something harder. Admiral, let me explain something to you simply. Those supplies are going to Proxima Station. The children are going to get their toys. The construction is going to continue. The only question is whether your ships are going to be in the way when we deliver them. The threat was so absurd that Zex Kalar almost laughed. 7 small ships threatening 300 Imperial vessels. But something in the human's tone made him pause. Captain, you are 7 ships against my entire fleet. What possible threat could you pose? Vasquez smiled, and this time there was something predatory in the expression. Admiral, how familiar are you with human military history? Irrelevant ancient conflicts. Zex Kalar dismissed. Your species has never faced the Imperial fleet. True, Vasquez agreed. But you've never faced humans either. Tell me, Admiral, do you know what a Trojan horse is? Before Zex Kalar could respond, his tactical officer was screaming alerts. Admiral. Energy signatures spiking on all human vessels. They're not cargo ships. They're packed with antimatter charges. The display lit up with proximity warnings as the 7 human ships suddenly accelerated toward the Imperial formation, not toward the flagship or command vessels, but toward the tightly packed cruiser squadrons in the fleet's center. Ships that had powered down weapons and shields in the certainty of their overwhelming superiority suddenly found themselves trying to restart systems as what they had thought were helpless cargo haulers revealed themselves to be something far more dangerous. All ships, emergency evasion, Zex Kalar commanded. But the Imperial fleet had been formed for intimidation, not for tactical maneuvering. Ships crowded together to present an overwhelming display of force now found that same crowding working against them as they tried to avoid collision with vessels that clearly had no intention of being avoided. Captain Vasquez's voice came through the comm one last time, calm and conversational despite the chaos erupting around her. Oh, Admiral, that documentation I mentioned? It's a message for High Regent Cathara. Tell her that humanity sends its regards. The first explosion lit up the tactical display like a newborn star. The merchant vessel Maria's Dream, packed with enough antimatter to power a space station, detonated in the middle of the Imperial cruiser formation. The blast wave caught 4 ships directly, reducing them to expanding clouds of superheated plasma, while the electromagnetic pulse disabled systems across half the fleet. But Maria's Dream was just the beginning. 6 more ships, 6 more precisely placed detonations, each one targeted to cause maximum disruption to Imperial formations. The humans had clearly studied Imperial fleet tactics, understood how Zephyrian ships clustered for mutual support, and turned that knowledge into a weapon. In less than 5 minutes, the Imperial Third Fleet lost 47 ships and suffered crippling damage to 80 more. The survivors found themselves scattered across the system, weapons offline, communications disrupted, and facing the impossible reality that they had just been mauled by an enemy that no longer existed to retaliate against. "Damage report!" Zex Kalar demanded, his form cycling through colors as his emotional control systems struggled to process what had happened. 17 cruisers destroyed, 30 frigates gone, multiple dreadnoughts with critical damage, Nexiarim reported, his own harmonic voice distorted by shock. "Admiral, they sacrificed themselves just to damage our fleet. Who does that?" Zex Kala didn't have an answer. In 3 centuries of Imperial dominance, no species had ever chosen mutual destruction over submission. The Zephyrian way of war was based on the assumption that all intelligent species valued self-preservation above all else. But the humans had just demonstrated a willingness to die that called that assumption into question. "Sir," another officer reported, "we're receiving transmissions from across the sector. Human vessels are attacking Imperial positions at every system simultaneously." The scope of the coordination became clear as reports flooded in. At the Imperial fuel depot in the Ross system, human freighters had launched suicide attacks against storage facilities, creating fireballs visible from 3 systems away. In the Wolf sector, human passenger ships had revealed hidden missile batteries and engaged Imperial patrols before self-destructing to prevent capture. Across 40 systems, humans were dying to inflict what should have been insignificant damage on Imperial forces. Except the damage wasn't insignificant. Each attack was precisely targeted, designed not just to destroy Imperial assets, but to disrupt supply lines, communications networks, and coordination systems. The humans weren't trying to win a conventional battle, they were trying to blind and cripple the Imperial war machine. And they were succeeding. "Admiral," Nexirim said quietly, "what are we dealing with?" Zex Kalar stared at the tactical display, watching the scattered remnants of his once proud fleet struggle to reorganize. 47 years of perfect victories, and it had taken the humans less than an hour to teach him the meaning of defeat. But more disturbing than the tactical reality was the strategic implication. The attacks weren't random acts of desperate defiance, they were coordinated operations that required months of planning, which meant that while the Empire had been congratulating itself on human submission, humanity had been preparing for war. "We're dealing with something the galaxy hasn't seen in 300 years, Zex Kalar said finally. "We're dealing with a species that refuses to acknowledge that they've lost." On Proxima Station, the children got their toys. The construction equipment was delivered on schedule. And across human space, a message spread through quantum communication networks faster than any Imperial response could follow. The Empire bleeds, the war has begun, and humanity remembers how to fight. But the real message was deeper than tactics or casualties. For 3 centuries, the Empire had ruled through the simple principle that resistance was futile. They had been demonstrably wrong, and in a galaxy where fear was the foundation of order, being wrong about something so fundamental was more dangerous than any fleet. Because fear, as humanity was about to demonstrate, was a weapon that could cut both ways, and the Empire was about to learn what it felt like to be afraid. The Corvan homeworld of Nexus Prime had not seen a protest in over 2 centuries. The very concept had been bred out of their culture through generations of Imperial conditioning, careful genetic modifications, and the systematic elimination of anyone who displayed what the Empire termed antisocial tendencies. But genetic modifications could not eliminate memory, and in the deepest archives of their ancestral libraries, the Corvan people still kept records of the time when their species had been warriors. Ambassador Thex stood in his private chambers, reading those forbidden texts by the light of bioluminescent panels that had been passed down through his family line. The translations were difficult. Imperial Standard had no words for many of the concepts his ancestors had treasured. Words like honor, defiance, freedom, sacrifice. The Empire had made sure of that. But watching the human ambassador in the Galactic Council had awakened something in Thex that he had thought dead. When Sarah Chen had spoken of Corvan warriors, when she called their current state defeat rather than wisdom, something had stirred in the depths of his memory. Something that whispered that his ancestors would be ashamed of what their children had become. Honored father. His daughter Yex clicked from the doorway, her mandibles betraying the anxiety that was becoming common among young Corvans. The news feeds are reporting massive human casualties in their attacks on Imperial forces. Perhaps this madness will end soon. Thex set down the ancient text he had been reading, a battle hymn from the Corvan Zephyrian War that had ended in their species' submission. "Come here, daughter. Sit with me." Yex approached cautiously. Her father had been acting strangely since returning from the council session, speaking little and spending hours in contemplation. "Father, you seem troubled." "Tell me," Dex said, "what do you know of the Battle of Seven Suns?" "It was a historical event." "Ancient history, before the Empire brought peace." "Yes, before peace." Thex activated a holographic display showing a star map of the Corvan sector as it had existed 300 years ago. Seven Suns was the last great battle of our independence war. 30,000 Corvan warriors faced an imperial fleet of 500,000 ships. Yak shifted uncomfortably. Such detailed military history was discouraged in imperial educational systems. "Father, why are you telling me this?" "Because the Empire taught you that it was a futile gesture. A waste of life. Proof that resistance was meaningless." Thex touched another control, and the display showed the battle itself. Corvan fighters impossibly outnumbered, throwing themselves against overwhelming odds. "But they didn't tell you what happened next." The hologram shifted, showing the aftermath. The Imperial fleet had won, but at a cost that shocked the galaxy. 30,000 Corvan warriors had destroyed almost a third of the Empire's total military force before being eliminated. The victory had been so costly that the Zephyrians had immediately offered terms rather than continue the war. "The Empire didn't defeat us through superior force," Bex continued. "They defeated us by making us believe that the cost of resistance was too high. They convinced us that 30,000 dead warriors were a tragedy rather than a triumph." Yex's mandibles clicked in confusion. "But father, they were dead." "How can death be triumph?" "Because," Thex said softly, "those 30,000 warriors proved that the Empire was not invincible. They proved that Zephyrian ships could burn, that Zephyrian tactics could fail, that Zephyrian arrogance could be turned into a weapon against them." He gestured towards the news feeds showing human attacks across Imperial space. "And now the humans are proving it again." Across the galaxy, similar conversations were taking place on 1,000 worlds. The human declaration of war had done something that 3 centuries of imperial conditioning had been designed to prevent. It had reminded subject species what defiance looked like. On the aquatic world of Ceticus, the dolphin-like Aquarians found themselves recalling their own warrior traditions as they watched human ships sacrifice themselves to strike at imperial supply lines. Their ancient war songs, forbidden for generations, began to echo through the deep cities once more. In the crystal caves of Mineralax, the silicon-based crystallites discovered that their youth had been secretly studying human military tactics, fascinated by the idea of a species that refused to acknowledge defeat. Imperial security forces tried to confiscate the contraband materials, only to find that the knowledge had already spread beyond their ability to contain. And in the vast orbital habitats of the Void Dancers, a species that had once been nomadic raiders before Imperial pacification programs settled them into carefully controlled communities, elders who had not spoken of the old ways in decades found young ones asking questions about the time before submission. But it was on the industrial world of Forgus that the first crack in Imperial control became a complete break. Forgus was a factory world, home to 60 billion beings from a dozen different species, all working in the massive manufacturing complexes that produced everything from starship components to luxury goods for the Imperial core worlds. The planet had no military significance, no strategic resources beyond its industrial capacity, and no history of resistance. It was exactly the sort of world where Imperial control was so complete that it required minimal oversight, which was why the rebellion that erupted there caught everyone by surprise. It started in the human quarter, in the workshops where Earthborn technicians labored alongside alien counterparts to produce Imperial war materiel. Marcus Webb had been a factory supervisor for 15 years, a steady worker who kept his head down and his opinions to himself. But when news of the human attacks reached Forgus, something changed. "We're building the ships they're using to kill our people," he said to his mixed-species work crew during their rest period. It was a simple observation, but in the context of the current war, it carried revolutionary implications. "What choice do we have?" asked Grex. 9. A synthetic being whose species had been created specifically to serve Imperial needs. Resistance brings only destruction.
Does it?
Webb pulled up a news feed on his personal communicator, showing footage of the attack on Admiral Zex Kalar's fleet. 7 human ships just crippled an Imperial fleet. "Does that look like destruction to you?" The question spread through the factory like a virus. For the first time in generations, workers began to wonder if their labor was supporting a system that was truly invincible, or just one that had convinced them it was invincible. The first act of sabotage was small, a batch of Starship processors manufactured with subtle defects that would cause system failures months after installation. The perpetrators were never found, but the message was clear: the Empire's industrial base was no longer secure. Within days, the sabotage escalated. Entire production runs of military components were discovered to have been contaminated with corrosive agents. Computer viruses began appearing in navigation systems. Construction mechs started producing parts that met all quality specifications but would fail catastrophically under combat stress. Imperial security forces responded predictably, flooding the planet with enforcement squads and implementing increasingly harsh penalties for industrial accidents. But the harder they cracked down, the more obvious it became that they were facing something entirely new. Not a coordinated resistance movement with clear leadership, but a spontaneous uprising of individuals who had simply decided to stop cooperating. The breaking point came when Security Chief Nex Polar ordered the execution of an entire work crew for suspected sabotage. The crew consisted of 12 beings from 6 different species, including 3 humans, 2 Corvins, and a crystallite who had been working in the same factory for 40 years. Their only crime was being assigned to the section where defective components had been discovered. The executions were carried out publicly, broadcast across the planet as a warning. But instead of terror, they produced something unexpected: rage. Webb stood in the crowd watching his co-workers die, and for the first time in his life, he understood what Ambassador Chen had meant when she spoke of choices. He could continue to keep his head down, continue to build ships for the Empire, continue to tell himself that cooperation was survival. Or he could choose to be human. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence that followed the executions. "I've had enough." He walked away from the execution ground, and to the amazement of the security forces, the entire crowd followed him. Not just humans, Corvins, crystallites, Aquarians, synthetics, dozens of species walking away from Imperial authority for the first time in their lives. The strike that followed paralyzed Forgus. Not just the factories, but the spaceports, the power plants, the communication networks, the transportation systems. Every function that required willing participation ground to a halt as billions of beings made the same simple decision: they would no longer cooperate. Imperial forces tried to restart production by force, but Starship manufacturing required skilled labor, not slave labor. You cannot threaten someone into properly calibrating a quantum drive or correctly installing a neural network. The Empire could compel physical labor, but they could not compel competence. Within a week, Forgus had gone from one of the Empire's most productive manufacturing centers to a dead weight that consumed resources without producing anything useful. Worse, the rebellion was spreading. Reports came in of similar strikes on industrial worlds across the sector, each one inspired by the example of workers who had decided that building weapons for their oppressors was no longer acceptable. High Region Kithara faced a crisis unlike anything in Imperial history. Military action could capture rebellious worlds, but it could not restore their productivity. Orbital bombardment could eliminate resistance, but it could also eliminate the industrial capacity that the Empire needed to function. For the first time in 3 centuries, the Empire's strength had become a weakness. And at the center of it all were the humans, the species that had somehow convinced half the galaxy that the impossible was actually inevitable. They were still dying in their attacks on Imperial forces, still sacrificing themselves in numbers that should have broken any rational resistance. But their sacrifice was not breaking them. It was inspiring others. In her private chambers on the Imperial capital world, High Regent Kithara studied intelligence reports that painted a picture of an empire under assault, not just by human military forces, but by the very idea of human defiance. Subject species that had been pacified for centuries were remembering what their ancestors had died for. Industrial worlds that had never known resistance were paralyzed by strikes. Even synthetic beings created specifically to serve Imperial needs were beginning to question their programming. How, she asked her advisory council, does a species that has lost every engagement convince the galaxy that they are winning? The question had no answer because it was based on a flawed premise. Humanity was not losing every engagement. They were redefining what victory meant. In a war where the enemy controlled overwhelming force, victory was not about conquering territory or destroying fleets. Victory was about proving that the enemy could be hurt, that their authority could be questioned, that their power was not absolute. And by that measure, humanity was winning decisively. The war was no longer about human independence. It had become about whether the galaxy would continue to accept Imperial dominance or choose to remember what freedom felt like. And across 10,000 worlds, that choice was becoming easier with each passing day. High Regent Kithara had ruled the Zephyrian Empire for 137 years, longer than any regent in history. She had overseen the integration of 17 species into imperial structure, the construction of the greatest starfleet in galactic history, and the establishment of peace across 10,000 worlds. Her crystalline form bore the accumulated wisdom of ages, and her harmonic voice had spoken laws that shaped the destiny of trillions. But as she stood in the imperial war chamber, surrounded by holographic displays showing rebellion spreading across her empire like a plague, she faced a situation that none of her predecessors had ever encountered: the systematic collapse of the fear that made her authority possible. "Forgus is completely lost," Admiral Nex Yoram reported, his crystal form dimmed with fatigue. "Industrial production has dropped to zero. Attempts to restart operations with forced labor have failed. The workers possess technical knowledge that cannot be replicated by security forces."
And the other worlds? Kithara asked, though she already knew the answer.
47 industrial planets are experiencing work stoppages. Resource extraction on 63 mining worlds has been disrupted by accidents that show clear signs of sabotage. Even core worlds are reporting suspicious delays in critical supplies. Nex Yoram paused, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of disbelief.
Regent, we estimate that overall Imperial productivity has dropped by 30% in just 2 weeks.
2 weeks. In 2 weeks, the humans had accomplished something that 3 centuries of conventional warfare had failed to achieve.
They had found a way to attack the Empire's industrial foundation, turning the galaxy's workforce into an unwitting army of saboteurs and resistors.
What of direct military action? Kithara inquired.
Surely our fleets can end this human madness. Admiral Kex Thane, commander of the First Imperial Fleet, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Regent, that is complicated. Human military tactics defy all conventional strategic logic. They appear to have no interest in holding territory, defending positions, or preserving their forces. They strike without warning, cause maximum damage, and either retreat or self-destruct before we can respond effectively. He activated a holographic display showing the past week's military actions. Yesterday, human raiders destroyed the shipyards at Proxima Borealis. The attacking force consisted of converted merchant vessels with no possibility of survival. The shipyards were defended by 3 battle groups. Yet the humans succeeded in their objective. How? They launched their attack during a shift change, when maximum personnel would be present. Rather than targeting the shipyard infrastructure, they detonated their ships in the personnel quarters. The facilities are intact but unusable. We lost 50,000 trained technicians and engineers. Kex Thane's form shifted to a troubled purple. Regent, they are not trying to defeat us militarily. They are trying to make victory meaningless. Quote, the observation struck at the heart of Kithara's growing unease. Traditional imperial strategy was built around demonstrating overwhelming superiority to convince enemies that resistance was futile. But how do you demonstrate superiority to an enemy that considers mutual destruction an acceptable outcome? Perhaps, suggested advisor Yex Kalam from the Economic Council, we should consider negotiating with the humans. Their initial demands were not unreasonable. Reparations for New Eden, territorial recognition, formal apology. The cost of this war may soon exceed the cost of compliance. The suggestion sent ripples of harmonic discord through the chamber. In 137 years of rule, Kithara had never negotiated with rebels. The precedent would be catastrophic. Negotiation implies equality, she replied firmly. The moment we treat humans as equals, every species in the Empire will demand the same consideration. Imperial authority rests on the principle that submission is the natural order. Compromise is impossible. But, even as she spoke the words, Kithara knew the situation was approaching crisis. Intelligence reports painted a picture of an empire where authority was dissolving at its edges. Species that had been model subjects for centuries were beginning to question orders, delay responses, and find excuses to avoid cooperation. The idea of resistance was proving more contagious than any biological weapon. What about the Absolute Protocol? Admiral Nex Yoram asked quietly. The chamber fell silent. The Absolute Protocol was the Empire's ultimate deterrent. A doctrine so terrible that it had never been implemented. Under Absolute Protocol, any species that engaged in armed resistance against the Empire would face complete extermination. Not just military defeat, but the sterilization of every world they inhabited, the destruction of every ship they possessed, the elimination of every trace of their existence from galactic history. The protocol requires unanimous consent from the War Council, Kithara said slowly, and proof that conventional methods have failed. Regent, Admiral Kexthane said, conventional methods have failed. Human military forces number less than 10,000 ships total. We have lost more vessels to their attacks than they possess. Our industrial capacity is crippled. Rebellion is spreading across the Empire. If this is not failure of conventional methods, what is? The logic was irrefutable, but Kithara hesitated. The Absolute Protocol had been created to deal with threats to Imperial survival, not to punish defiant subjects. Its implementation would mark a fundamental change in the nature of Imperial rule, from dominance through fear to dominance through extermination. There is another consideration, Advisor Yex Kalam interjected. The humans have somehow convinced other species that resistance is possible. If we implement Absolute Protocol against humanity, we send a clear message: resist the Empire and face extinction. This may actually strengthen Imperial authority by demonstrating the consequences of defiance. The argument was compelling. The galaxy needed to see that human defiance led nowhere but destruction. Other species needed to understand that the Empire's patience, while vast, was not infinite. Humanity would serve as an example that would prevent future rebellions for millennia to come. Very well, Kithara said finally. Convene the full War Council. We will consider implementation of Absolute Protocol. The War Council session that followed was unlike any in Imperial history. For 6 hours, the Empire's greatest military and political minds debated the fate of humanity. Arguments ranged from practical considerations, the enormous cost of simultaneously attacking every human settlement, to philosophical ones about the nature of Imperial justice. But in the end, the decision was unanimous. Humanity had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Their defiance threatened the foundations of Imperial order. They had chosen extinction, and the Empire would grant their wish. Let the order be transmitted to all Imperial forces, Trithara declared. Effective immediately, humanity is designated a threat to galactic stability. All human worlds, ships, and installations are to be destroyed without exception. No prisoners will be taken, no surrenders will be accepted. Humanity will be erased from galactic history as an example of the price of defying Imperial authority. The order went out through quantum communication networks, reaching Imperial fleets across the galaxy in moments. Commanders who had been frustrated by human tactics suddenly found themselves with simple, clear objectives: kill every human they could find. The first targets were obvious. Earth itself, the human homeworld, defended by a small fleet that stood no chance against the 3 Imperial battle groups approaching the Sol system. Mars, Venus, Luna, the industrial centers of human space, were indefensible against the forces being deployed against them. But as Imperial fleets moved to execute the Absolute Protocol, they discovered something that their intelligence networks had somehow missed. Humanity was no longer confined to human space. The first indication came from Admiral Dex Moran, commander of the force assigned to sterilize the Tau Ceti colonies. War Council, we have a problem. Long-range scans show extensive evacuation activity. The colonies appear to be nearly empty. Similar reports flooded in from across the galaxy. Human settlements that should have contained millions showed signs of hasty abandonment. Industrial facilities were operating under skeleton crews or had been completely evacuated. Even Earth itself, when the Imperial fleet finally arrived, showed evidence of massive population transfers. Where have they gone? Kithara demanded. The answer came from an unexpected source. Ambassador Thex, representing the Corvan Confederacy, requested an emergency audience with the Imperial Council. When granted permission to speak, his first words sent shockwaves through the assembled leadership. We are hiding them. The simple statement carried enormous implications. The Corvans, model subjects for 2 centuries, were openly admitting to harboring refugees from a species under Imperial death sentence. It was not just a violation of Imperial law, it was an act of war. Explain yourself, Kithara commanded, her form burning with anger. Dex stood straighter than he had in decades, his mandibles clicking with what his ancestors would have recognized as battle readiness. When humanity declared war on the Empire, they knew they could not protect their civilians through military action. So they asked for sanctuary.
We provided it.
We? The Corvan Confederacy, the Aquarian Depths, the Crystallite Communes, the Void Dancer Fleets, the Synthetic Collectives, 47 species, have opened their worlds to human refugees. They are scattered across the galaxy, integrated into our populations, hidden in our cities.
The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Nearly half the species in the Empire had coordinated to violate Imperial law on an unprecedented scale. They had not just hidden humans, they had made human extinction impossible without genocide on a galactic scale. You understand, Kithara said slowly, that harboring enemies of the Empire makes you enemies of the Empire? Yes, Thex replied simply. We understand. And you accept the consequences? For the first time in 2 centuries, a Corvan warrior smiled in the presence of Imperial authority. We accept that the Empire can destroy our worlds, our ships, our bodies. But there is one thing the Empire cannot destroy. And what is that? The idea that resistance is possible, the knowledge that empires are not eternal, the understanding that free beings do not have to kneel. Thex's mandibles clicked in rhythm with words that came from the deepest memories of his species. You can kill the rebels, but you cannot kill the rebellion. You can silence the voices, but you cannot silence the echo. You can destroy the humans, but you cannot destroy what humanity has taught us. The session ended with the Empire facing an impossible choice. Implementing absolute protocol against humanity now meant implementing it against nearly half their subject species. The limited demonstration of Imperial ruthlessness had become a war of extermination that would leave the Empire ruling over empty systems. But backing down would mean acknowledging that human defiance had succeeded in its ultimate goal, proving that the Empire was not all-powerful, that its subjects were not property, and that the natural order the Zephyrians had imposed was neither natural nor permanent. As the War Council debated impossible options, Kithara realized that the humans had achieved something remarkable. They had not defeated the Empire militarily. That was impossible. Instead, they had forced the Empire to defeat itself. Because an empire that could only rule through extermination was no longer an empire worth ruling. Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the Earth Defense Station, watching Imperial dreadnoughts burn in the space around humanity's homeworld. The battle had lasted 3 days, and while the Imperial fleet still outnumbered the defenders by overwhelming margins, something fundamental had changed in the calculus of warfare. The humans were no longer fighting alone. The first non-human ships had arrived 6 hours into the battle, emerging from hyperspace with transponder codes that should have been impossible. Corvan battle cruisers operating under their ancient war clan banners instead of Imperial registry. Then came the Aquarian deep space raiders, ships that hadn't been seen in Imperial space for 2 centuries. Crystallite mining vessels converted into missile platforms, Void Dancer attack squadrons flying in formation patterns that predated Imperial tactical doctrine by millennia. 47 species had sent ships to defend Earth, each one making a choice that 3 months ago would have been unthinkable. They were not just fighting alongside humans, they were fighting for the principle that humanity represented. Ambassador Admiral Martinez approached, his uniform bearing scorch marks from the emergency decompression that had nearly killed him when Imperial plasma fire breached the command section. We're receiving a transmission from the Imperial flagship. High Regent Kithara is requesting parley. Chen turned from the viewport, where the debris of 3 Imperial battle groups painted streaks of light across Earth's sky. Parley? Not surrender? She's requesting direct communication with human leadership. She specifically asked for you. The irony was not lost on Chen. 3 months ago, she had been a junior diplomat, whose primary responsibility was managing trade disputes over mineral rights. Now, the ruler of the galaxy's greatest empire wanted to negotiate with her personally. Put her through. The holographic display shimmered to life, revealing High Regent Kithara in what appeared to be a damaged command center. Her crystalline form, usually radiant with controlled energy, seemed dim and fragmented. Behind her, Chen could see Zephyrian officers working frantically at damaged control stations. Ambassador Chen! Kithara's harmonic voice carried undertones that Chen's translation software marked as exhaustion, mixed with something that might have been respect. It appears we need to talk. High Regent, Chen replied formally. I assume you're prepared to discuss reparations for New Eden? I am prepared to discuss the survival of galactic civilization, Kithara corrected. Your species has accomplished something remarkable, Ambassador. You have convinced the galaxy to choose destruction over order. Chen glanced at the tactical displays showing the ongoing battle. Imperial forces were still vastly superior in numbers and technology, but they were losing ground steadily as more and more non-human fleets arrived to join the defense of Earth. Species that had been Imperial subjects for centuries were openly defying their masters, and the defiance was spreading faster than Imperial forces could respond to it. We convinced the galaxy to choose freedom over slavery, Chen replied. The fact that you see that as destruction says everything about your empire that needs saying. Perhaps, Cathara acknowledged. But consider the practical reality. If this war continues, it will not end with human victory. It will end with the collapse of imperial infrastructure and the regression of galactic civilization to pre-contact primitivism. Billions will die, trillions more will suffer. Is your principle worth that cost? The question was one that Chen had been wrestling with since the war began. Humanity's declaration of independence had unleashed forces that none of them had fully anticipated. The Empire's authority was crumbling, but what was replacing it was not an ordered transition to freedom, it was chaos. Industrial worlds were paralyzed by strikes. Trade routes were disrupted by piracy from species that had rediscovered their raiding traditions. Communication networks were failing as technicians from a dozen different species refused to cooperate with Imperial maintenance protocols. The careful infrastructure that supported quadrillions of beings across 10,000 worlds was breaking down. High Regent, Chen said slowly. 3 months ago, you could have avoided all of this by simply apologizing for New Eden and agreeing to treat humans as equals. You chose to double down on Empire instead. Every death since then is on your hands, not ours. And yet the dying continues, Cathara pointed out. Ambassador, I am not contacting you to assign blame. I am contacting you because you are the only authority that the rebel species seem to recognize. If you call for an end to hostilities, they will listen. It was true, Chen realized. Somehow, in the 3 months since her declaration in the Galactic Council, she had become something she had never intended to be. The de facto leader of an interstellar rebellion. Species that had never shown interest in human opinion suddenly treated her words as gospel. Military commanders who had never met a human were coordinating their strategies based on intercepted human communications. But leadership meant responsibility, and responsibility meant making choices that other people would have to live with. What are you proposing? Chen asked. A new order, Cathara replied. Not the return of imperial dominance, but not the chaos of complete collapse either. A confederation of free species, each governing their own territory, cooperating through voluntary association rather than forced submission. With humans as equals, with humans as founding members. Your species has proven that forced submission is no longer sustainable. Perhaps voluntary cooperation will prove more durable. Chen studied the High Regent's image, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But Cathara's damaged surroundings and the exhaustion in her harmonic voice suggested that this was not a tactical ploy. This was an admission of defeat. And what happens to the Empire? The Empire ends. Cathara said simply, Imperial authority is dissolved. Species choose their own governments, establish their own laws, control their own destinies. The Zephyrians become one voice among many instead of the single voice that drowns out all others. The offer was everything humanity had hoped for when they first declared war. It was also everything the rebellion had been fighting for. But Chen found herself hesitating, not because the terms were inadequate, but because they seemed too good to be true. High Regent, forgive my skepticism, but your empire has ruled through force for 3 centuries. What guarantee do we have that this isn't just a tactical retreat while you rebuild your strength? You have the guarantee that rebuilding imperial strength is no longer possible, Cathara replied. Ambassador, look at your tactical displays. How many non-human ships are defending your homeworld? Chen checked the status boards. The numbers were staggering. Over 2,000 ships from dozens of different species, all flying under their own ancient flags instead of imperial banners. Approximately 2,000. And how many of those ships are powered by imperial technology? Supplied through imperial logistics? Maintained by imperial infrastructure? The question made Chen's stomach drop as she realized the implications. All of them. Precisely. The rebellion has succeeded beyond your wildest expectations, Ambassador. But success carries a price. Those ships can fight for weeks, perhaps months, using stored supplies and spare parts. But they cannot fight forever without the industrial base that created them, and that industrial base is collapsing as we speak. Cathara activated a holographic display showing the galactic economy in real time. The picture was horrifying. Trade routes marked in red to indicate disruption, industrial centers showing declining output, resource flows strangled by political chaos. Your war has not just defeated the Empire militarily, Cathara continued. It has convinced the galaxy that imperial infrastructure is a tool of oppression rather than a foundation of civilization. The result is systematic collapse of the economic and technological networks that support interstellar society. Chen stared at the display, watching the slow-motion catastrophe that her declaration of war had unleashed. Billions of beings who had never heard of New Eden were facing starvation as food distribution networks failed. Entire star systems were going dark as power generation facilities were abandoned by their multinational crews. Medical shipments were stranded in warehouses as transport workers refused to cross species boundaries that were being redrawn daily.
So what you're saying, Chen said slowly, is that we can have freedom or we can have civilization, but not both. I am saying that we can have a new form of civilization based on cooperation instead of domination, Cathara corrected. But only if the transition is managed, rather than catastrophic. Only if those who understand imperial systems work with those who represent the rebellion to build something better. The irony was overwhelming. Humanity had fought for the right to say no to the Empire, and now the Empire was asking them to say yes to something unprecedented. A voluntary dissolution of the greatest political structure in galactic history. Chen looked again at the tactical display, where ships from 4 species were fighting and dying to protect a world they had never seen, defending principles they had never been allowed to believe in. They were fighting because humanity had shown them that resistance was possible. But resistance was only the beginning. Building something better was infinitely harder. If we agree to this, Chen said, humanity wants guarantees. Full reparations for New Eden. Territorial sovereignty for all human worlds. Representation in whatever confederation replaces the Empire, proportional to our contribution to the war effort. Agreed, Cathara said without hesitation. And trials. War crimes tribunals for imperial officials responsible for atrocities against civilian populations. That will be more difficult, but if it ensures peace, it is acceptable. Chen took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would shape the future of the galaxy. Then on behalf of humanity and our allies, I accept your proposal for the dissolution of the Empire and the establishment of a free confederation of species. The holographic display flickered as the transmission ended, leaving Chen alone with the weight of what had just been accomplished. In 3 months, humanity had gone from grateful junior partners in the galactic community to architects of a new galactic order. They had achieved something that no species in the galaxy had thought possible. They had forced an empire to voluntarily surrender. But as Chen watched the battle around Earth gradually wind down, as Imperial ships powered down their weapons and began transmitting surrender codes, she realized that the hardest work was just beginning. Destroying an empire was dramatic and straightforward. Building a free society from its ashes would require everything humanity had learned about cooperation, compromise, and the delicate balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. Across the galaxy, other species were facing the same realization. The Corvans would need to remember how to govern themselves after centuries of imperial administration. The Aquarians would need to rebuild their oceanic cities without imperial infrastructure. The Crystallites would need to establish trade relationships as equals rather than subjects. And humanity would need to learn how to be leaders rather than rebels, to build rather than destroy, to take responsibility for the galactic civilization they had helped to reshape. 3 months ago, Sarah Chen had been a diplomat managing trade disputes. Now she was one of the founding architects of a new galactic order, based on principles that humanity had died to defend. That freedom was worth any price, that empires were not eternal, and that sometimes the greatest victory was teaching your enemies that winning through domination was really losing. The age of the Zephyrian Empire was over. The age of the Galactic Confederation had begun. And at its heart was a simple principle that humanity had learned in the ashes of New Eden, that people who refuse to kneel cannot be made to serve. The galaxy had learned that lesson well, and it would never forget.